Welcome to this unique event. It's great to have you here. This is the first time that Christ Church Chislehurst has created its own community passion. One Friday, almost 2,000 years ago, in the city of Jerusalem, a good man called Jesus set out on a journey that would change the world. He walked less than a mile, but in the course of that day's journey he was wrongly arrested, betrayed by his closest friends, tried in a rigged court, and then horribly executed in public. From the events of that day in a corner of the Middle East, a message of forgiveness, hope and reconciliation has spilled out through the centuries to every corner of the world. That's why Christians call this Good Friday.
Our story begins on Thursday evening. Jesus and his friends had gone to Gethsemane, a small plantation of olive trees just outside Jerusalem. It's pretty clear that he knew what the next 24 hours would hold.
Jesus said to his friends, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." Full of sorrow and distress, he fell prostrate in prayer, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." When he returned to his disciples, he found them asleep.
Have you ever had to face something really tough, like Jesus did, and face it on your own? Maybe you're worried about the future. Maybe you're worried about today. Jesus faced the fear and knows what we face. Jesus is arrested. Before Jesus and his friends had a chance to leave the garden, a mob arrived. They were heavily tooled up with knives and sticks, and they'd come to arrest Jesus. Judas, one of Jesus' friends, arrived. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, who had come from the chief priests, the scribes and the elders. His betrayer had arranged a signal with them, saying, "The man I shall kiss is the one. Arrest him and lead him away." He immediately went over to Jesus and said, "Teacher." He kissed him, and they grabbed him and arrested him. So Jesus was betrayed, grasped up by one of his closest friends. But he'd done nothing to deserve arrest. He was unarmed and had no history of violence. This arrest was totally unjustified. It was purely political, a set-up for the cameras.
It's terrible to be betrayed, and even more so when you're let down by someone you loved and trusted. Think about that theme of betrayal.
Jesus is condemned. The next morning, Jesus was dragged in front of the court known as the Sanhedrin, the local magistrates' court. It was their job to work out whether he had a case to answer. He was accused of claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God. He refused to plead, but he was judged anyway.
When day came, the council of elders of the people met, and they brought him before the Sanhedrin. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." But he replied to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question, you will not respond. But from this time on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "We don't need to hear from any other witnesses. We've heard it from his own mouth."
Sometimes we have to make huge choices that will affect our lives, even though we don't feel we have enough information. Where will I live? Who will I live with? These people had to decide whether Jesus was just a troublemaker or whether he really was claiming to be God. And since claiming to be God was punishable by death, they were effectively deciding whether the man in front of them would live or die. I wonder when you have judged somebody or felt judged. Jesus is betrayed by his friend. If Jesus had a best friend, it was probably Peter. Peter had been with Jesus since the very beginning. Now Jesus was in big trouble. He was under arrest and could be facing the death penalty. Did Peter stand by him? No, he pretended he didn't know him. Not once, but again and again.
Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard A woman came over to him and said, "You were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it in front of everyone, saying, "I don't know what you're talking about." As he went out to the gate, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This man was with Jesus the Nazarene." Again he denied it, saying, "I don't know the man." A little later the bystanders came over and said to Peter, "Surely you are with them. Your accent gives you away." At that he began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately a cockerel crowed. Then Peter remembered the word that Jesus had spoken, "Before the cockerel crows, you will deny me 3 times." He went out and began to weep bitterly.
Peter must have hated himself, especially when he remembered that Jesus had once predicted he would do that. Jesus knew him better than he knew himself. He wept bitterly, partly for the good, the friend he was losing, but also for the bad friend he had become. Have you ever been let down by a friend? I mean really let down. It feels terrible, doesn't it? And usually it feels just as terrible for the person who's been disloyal to you.
Now Jesus was handcuffed. In this powerless state he was brought face to face with Pontius Pilate, the most powerful man in the whole country. Pilate had the authority to release Jesus or to have him executed. What he couldn't do is get a straight answer out of him. For some reason Jesus didn't even want to defend himself. Perhaps he knew that Pilate would never understand his message. Perhaps he wanted to teach Pilate a lesson about the limits of his power.
They tied up Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He said to him in reply, "You say so." The chief priests accused him of many things. Again Pilate questioned him, "Have you no answer? See how many things they accuse you of." Jesus gave him no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Pilate, wishing to stay on the right side of the crowd, released Barabbas and handed Jesus over to be crucified.
In the end it turned out that Pilate, the most powerful man in the land, was more scared than Jesus, the prisoner in the dock. Under pressure from the crowd, Pilate released a convicted murderer and sentenced Jesus to death. Here you've got an immensely powerful man, Pontius Pilate, the Prime Minister of the province, face to face with Jesus, tied up and seemingly powerless. And yet it seems like it was Pilate who had his hands tied. With all the power in the world, he felt like there was nothing he could do. And Jesus, with all the power in heaven, chose to do nothing. Think about what it feels to have power, but also to consider what it's like to be powerless.
Jesus is tortured and mocked. When Pontius Pilate had made his decision to sentence Jesus to death, he handed him over to the palace guards to carry out the execution. But before they killed him, they wanted to have some fun with him. So they stripped Jesus of his own clothes and dressed him up like a pretend king. Then he was mocked and tortured. Jesus was powerless, naked and defenceless.
Then Pilate took Jesus and had him whipped, and the soldiers wove a crown out of thorns and placed it on his head, and clothed him in a purple cloak. And they came to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him repeatedly.
Hopefully none of us will ever have to face torture, but we all know what it's like to be mocked. From the political debate to the playground, ridicule is a powerful weapon. It strips away a person's dignity and humanity and makes them vulnerable. It makes the bully feel strong. Jesus carries his cross. When they had finished torturing him, the soldiers brought 2 huge pieces of timber that they had made into a cross shape. This was the cross on which they planned to kill him. Already weakened by a terrible beating, Jesus was forced to carry the heavy wood up the hill towards his place of execution. Christians believe that Jesus also carried the weight of the world's evil to the cross with him.
When the chief priests and the guards saw Jesus, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no guilt in him." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross himself, he went out to a place called Skull Hill.
There are many different types of burden, but all of us, some have some burdens to carry. Some are visible and some only we know about. Our burdens can weigh us down, especially if we have to carry them alone. Jesus is helped by a stranger. As he travelled towards his crucifixion, Jesus was surrounded by a hostile, angry, jeering crowd. Seeing that he was stumbling, the soldiers pulled a random bystander from the crowd and forced him to carry Jesus' cross. All we know about him is that his name was Simon and that he was a foreigner. Had one of the soldiers taken pity on Jesus, or had Simon volunteered in an act of mercy towards a stranger? Either way, Simon took the burden of the heavy cross, and his kindness enabled Jesus to continue his lonely journey.
They pressed into service a passer-by, Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. Kindness, particularly from strangers, is unexpected and can make a huge impact on our lives.